So hello, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today, whether it's day or morning or night, depending on where you are. My name is Evia Hauptmann, and I will be introducing today's dialogue. And usually we would be starting with a land acknowledgement, and I will not be doing that today as I'm currently located in Copenhagen in Denmark, which isn't colonized land. Instead, I will proceed to a short introduction of myself and then this dialogue series. As I said, my name is Evia. I'm a microbiologist. I have a background in applied microbiology and biotechnology. My PhD was in metagenomic approaches to Arctic environments. And today I'm a visiting postdoc at Professor Maria Marco's lab at UC Davis, where my research focuses on indigenous Inuit foods from Greenland, where I was born and raised. So it's been a real pleasure for me to take part in this group that you see gathered here on the screen. We are a research cluster anchored at the University of California, Davis, and we come together on the topic of fermentation and indigenous perspectives and the social science of research. Together, we coordinate this transcollege research cluster that we call Radical and Relational Approaches to Fermentation and Food Sovereignty. And we wish to initiate interdisciplinary dialogues about fermentation science, indigenous food security and food sovereignty, as well as performance, feminist science studies, and radical relational approaches to fermentation. And you can find out a lot more about who we are and what we do at our webpage. It's radicalfermentation.ucdavis.edu. So the goal of these events is to offer explanations of our individual research projects as they intersect with the topics that we work with in our cluster. So we explore the relationships between and amongst our seemingly very different fields of expertise. So we'll go on with the dialogue now with short introductions to each of us, after which we'll hear Dr. Stephanie Maroney dive into her area of research. And after Stephanie's talk, Stephanie Maria will start the dialogue and discuss different questions. And we welcome you all to take part in that by posting questions or comments in the Q&A. So I'll let you all introduce yourselves.
Yeah, I really do. My name is Jessica Bissett-Perea. I am a Dena'ina or Alaska Native musician and scholar. I'm currently an assistant professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis. My primary communities of practice are rooted in Alaska and the North Pacific and circumpolar subarctic regions more generally. And I consider myself an Indigenous feminist historian and theorist, and I specialize in Indigenous-led research methods in arts and humanities. So my interest in radical and relational approaches to fermentation are kind of expanding multisensorial ways of knowing, especially sound and taste, right? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Marco. I'm a professor in the Department of Food Science and Technology at UC Davis. My work centers on food microbiology and understanding how microorganisms may benefit our health through our digestive tract. I specialize in the study of lactic acid bacteria for their roles in food fermentations and as probiotics. My research encompasses genetic, ecological, and microbiome-centric approaches designed to understand the molecular, mechanistic basis for microbial interactions in foods and the digestive tract. Through my research, teaching, and service commitments, I strive to provide inclusive approaches that allow us to relate to and understand microscopic life.
And my name is Stephanie Maroney, and I am a feminist science and technology studies and cultural studies scholar at the University of California, Davis, where I administer a program here that helps arts and humanities graduate students come up with community engaged research projects. And I'm going to be talking more about my work today, so I'll stop with the introduction at this point and kind of move into my presentation. I wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for joining, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share more about my work with you and what I've been up to and invite you all to kind of be a part of this collaboration. All right, so I'm going to switch to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that. So welcome, to the Radical and Relational Fermentation Dialogue series. I hope you've been able to join some of these before, and I will be talking today, but we have one more left in our series. Oh, there we go. So just to give you an outline of my talk today, I'm going to give a brief introduction, which building on Professor Pereira's workshop 2 weeks ago, or her dialogue 2 weeks ago, I like to think of the introduction as an invitation. So I'm going to use that format where I talk about myself and my life, not so much to, I don't know, be self-indulgent, but rather as an invitation for you to understand more about where I come from and why I find certain things important. And maybe we can build some kind of familiarity through shared experiences. Then I'm going to describe some of the things that I've done. So I'm going to talk about people and places and practices that I've built up with these experiments using fermentation as a method. I'll say a little bit more about that. And then I'm going to leave off this talk with what I think are my contributions to this group, to the Radical and Relational Approaches to Fermentation and Food Sovereignty group, which specifically is, my training and approaches in feminist science and technology studies, as well as my work in public scholarship and community engaged research. So my email address is there, and I welcome anyone to follow up if you wanted to know more about my talk afterwards. This video is being recorded and it'll be posted to our website, which is the next link there. Or if you want to know more about the Public Scholars program that I manage, that link is also available to you to learn more about the cool work that grad students are doing at UC Davis. So the introduction, I come from people who have lived in this California, Yolo County, Sacramento County, since the early 1900s, when my great-grandparents came here from Italy, outside of Lucca, to work in agriculture. And they came here and they started a family, and they had 3 kids, one of which was Mary Annie Andreozzi, who is my grandmother. And she married an Irishman in this area, a shoe salesman named James Maroney. And they started a family in this very close region here in near Orrville, and settling in Roseville, California, in the 1950s. And they had 3 kids, one of which was my dad, James Maroney, who married Tommy Gavigan. And that's their picture down there. And they had me in San Jose in the 1980s. And so I kind of have a connection to this place that I'm in now, although I was not raised here. I was born in San Jose, California, but I lived kind of throughout the Inland Empire in Southern California because my dad worked in retail. So we moved quite a bit in the early parts of my life. And that kind of led us to Arizona, which is where I spent a lot of my childhood. And my mother's family has also a kind of longer history in Arizona. In the 1880s, actually, I have family who moved here from Illinois and kind of took advantage of settler, programs for farming lands that belonged to Hohokam and O'odham people. But they were farmers, and through several generations that you see here, built up some, land and practices of sheep and cotton and citrus and the other things that Arizona is known for exporting. But eventually in the 1950s, my grandmother, Ruth Hortense Jones, married Harold Gavigan, and they opened a bar in Cave Creek that's still called Harold's Cave Creek Corral. And my mother was raised there with her kids, or with her siblings, sorry, until she met my dad, and they started their family, and eventually settling in Phoenix in the 1990s, me and my brother. And that's where I met my partner, Michael Sutton, and where we had our twins, Ozzy and Elliot. So I was educated for the most part in Arizona. I am a first generation college student. I went to community college and then got a scholarship to go to a local state school where I got my bachelor's and my master's degree, and managed to have twins along the way. And so being a parent is obviously a formative part of my life. And eventually, after that experience, I moved back to this region to go to graduate school, get my PhD at UC Davis. And I received my degree in 2018, a PhD in the Cultural Studies program, which is a kind of interdisciplinary arts and humanities program here at UC Davis, and an emphasis in feminist theory and research. And the dissertation that I completed was called Eat for Your Microbes, Reimagining Diet, Health, and Subjectivity in the Probiotic Present. And it was a dissertation that looked at the social cultural impact of human microbiome science and the way that it was shaping new ideas about bodies and health and eating, but also drawing from longstanding tropes in science and in other kinds of fields around how we think about diet as controlling human bodies and its relationship to social values. So I will talk more about that work because it ended up becoming some articles that I'll say with a little more detail about them. But now I work at UC Davis in the Mellon Public Scholars program, and I'm helping kind of graduate students come up with community engaged research projects that they want to do. This slide, I wanted to transition a little bit, away from more of a kind of this is who I am and what I do to why I do what I do now, and how I started to work in experimental practices in fermentation. And it comes from, a real loneliness, I would say, that happened as I was finishing my dissertation. And if anybody is a grad student watching this right now, you know the feeling that it's very isolating when one is finishing dissertation research and you are doing a lot of writing. It's a lot of solitary work. And you are confronted with norms of an institution that maybe are unfamiliar to you, that you maybe don't agree with, but you know that you have to conform to them to some degree in order to get the degree. And so I just found myself in a place where I was just really dissatisfied with the solitary work of being a scholar. And I knew that there had to be another way to do the thing I wanted to do, that was my research, but in a way that felt affirming and connected me to other people and was tied into something that I cared about. I care about my dissertation for sure, but it was felt more like a chore at this point in my life. That's why this slide is so fun. I decided, coming out of that experience, that the future work that I wanted to do, it needed to be different than what it was. And certainly it needed to be different from a life in academia that I had seen modeled by other faculty members or through other sites of the university that I belonged to. And it led me to kind of think more about what do I want to do and how do I want to do it. So there was an activity that sometimes in the science and technology studies program, we'd all go around the table and you'd have to say 3 words about your research, so none of these long introductions that take 20 minutes before you even start a talk, but just 3 words. And my 3 words were always food, feminism, and fermentation. Food meaning food studies, so the kind of social, cultural, political study of the way that food shapes our lives, our histories, the way that it's been implicated in colonial practices, in issues of power, and the way that it shapes our culture and our heritage, both positively and negatively. And then feminism, as in, not just the study of, women in society, but feminism as an approach to knowing, a way of knowing the world that centers justice and liberation and kind of acknowledges the interlocking structures of white cis heteropatriarchy, which I'll talk more about at the end of my presentation too. And then finally, fermentation, which both was something that I was studying in my dissertation, but I as a person trained in literary studies, I was fascinated by fermentation as a kind of practice that we do, as a method for making things in the world, but also as a theory for considering relationships, for imagining new ways of doing things together. The transformative bubbles of fermentation is kind of conceptually powerful, as well as the practice of fermentation itself. So I like to think across these three spaces. And then the words in pink here, in pink highlighting, was more about how I wanted to do these things. So experimentation was very important to me. I want to move in a way in the world where I'm saying yes to new things, where I am not fearing failure. And certainly there's an impulse towards perfectionism in the academy that didn't feel great. And I didn't want to spend my life doing that. And I wanted to be in spaces where I could just move from my feelings and from a kind of space of an expansive space of things being possible. Making bad art was an example of something that really kind of soothed me after the experience of finishing a dissertation. And moreover, I wanted experimentation to be something that allowed for me to be open to surprises. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's what learning kind of is for me. Collaboration was fundamental. I never wanted to go alone. I never wanted to have to be the only one or pretend that I was the only one, because none of us, form knowledge or make knowledge in vacuums by ourselves. We're always indebted to all the others that have come before us and all the people we share our thoughts and spaces with. And I wanted to just be more honest about that process in my life. So collaboration was something I wanted to forefront. I wanted to learn with others about all kinds of things. And by paying attention and prioritizing collaboration, it made me more attuned to relations rather than, outputs or products. Which brings me to to thinking about method, that I wanted to focus more on the how I did things rather than what, I did or like an outcome of it. By focusing on method, I was paying attention to process and pacing rather than final products or final outcomes. And I think that this attention to process and to a slowing down allows me to care for the relationships that come out of collaborations. And it allows me to be more reflective about the surprises that come out of experimentation itself, which all leads to the idea of wanting to make a life. That all the things that we often say my research is or my work is about, I no longer wanted to think of those things as separate from the rest of my life. Certainly we all need to compartmentalize to get through our busy lives, but I was frustrated with thinking of that as like an actually separate thing I did. And I wanted it to be more kind of integrated into who I was and how I made knowledge with others in the world. So attention to making a life helps me not pay so much attention to making a living around the work that I do. Although of course that's important, but I didn't want it to be the most important thing that I paid attention to. And I wanted to move in ways towards projects that I care about with people that I care about. So this is the kind of world that I'm in. This is my headspace. This is where fermentation, where my thoughts on fermentation come from. A lot of this was, not necessarily crystallized, but it started, it started to ferment when I went to the Foundation for Fermentation Fervor in 2014, which is Sandor Katz's kind of fermentation school in rural Tennessee. I went there to do field work for my dissertation because at that time I was thinking about Katz's work and about fermentation more broadly as one in a long line of examples of how food reformers have used ideas about food to change the world or to change social ideas. And I certainly think that is still the case in a lot of the way we talk about fermentation. But when I went to this residency, it was 3 weeks living outside, camping with other beautiful people that were interested in practices of fermentation in a queer rural commune in Tennessee, where a lot of the things that we did were integrated with the farms around us, with water that came out of a spring, with people that were kind of reliant on the sharing practices that were centered in this fermentation space. It really illuminated for me the way that Sandor Katz, through his work, and specifically through his connection to other queer people in the space of this sanctuary, how fermentation became a way to actually care for each other and to care for relationships, both between people, but between the natural world as well. And it kind of sparked something in me to start to think about fermentation as a practice, as a method, as a way to take care of each other. And I tried to find ways to practice that. I was fortunate to make a lifelong friend in that experience, Sean Nash, who's a visual artist based out of Kansas City. And one of the first things that we did together after finishing the residency was to respond to a call for proposals from Lorraine Fournier, who put out an invitation for people to respond to this idea of fermenting feminism. And so Sean and I submitted a piece that is a kind of art, creative writing collaboration for the collection that was also a part of an installation in Kansas City with some of the other artists that were a part of the Fermenting Feminism collection that explored queerness in the context of both microbiology, in the context of the sanctuary where the Foundation for Fermentation Fervor is located, and our own kind of experiences as people who felt transformed by the time that we spent in Tennessee. And we continue to be inspired by the queer activity of microbes and also explore the kind of artistic components or the artistic capacities that fermentation inspires in us. Another great project that emerged from these collaborations and from my being attuned to how others were thinking of fermentation as a creative, theoretical, metaphorical practice was a conference that was organized by Maya Hay in Montreal called Food, Feminism, and Fermentation. My 3 words, I had to go to this conference. And Sean and I proposed to talk about our work together at this conference. And we also made some great collaborations, particularly with a collective called Lady Brew Winnipeg, who are based in Winnipeg, Canada. And they make really wonderful, interesting beers like this one in the corner called Double Reindeer, which is made with reindeer blood and reindeer lichen. Just was so inspired to be around other folks, some of whom are pictured in this photograph, that were working with fermentation practices, but also kind of allowing themselves to be inspired by the process of fermentation itself in the work that they do. And through my participation in this conference, I was able to turn some of my fieldwork into this article that was published in this special issue of Cuisine and the article title is Sandor Katz and the Possibilities of a Queer Fermentive Praxis. And it really is my articulation, a further articulation of what I was just saying around how much I appreciated the way that Katz used fermentation as a way to care for his community, and the role that fermentation can play in those kinds of spaces was quite inspiring. That work and those relationships continued with another group of folks who I knew through my work with the Society for the Social Studies of Science, which is a kind of academic group of people that are in the field of STS. And 2 colleagues there, Sarah Tracy and Rachel Vaughn, organized a conference called Edible Feminisms that brought together people working at the intersection of food studies and science and technology studies. And from that experience, I had the immense pleasure of working with E.A. Hobart, who is now at University of Texas, Austin, in the anthropology department, and we co-authored an article called On Racial Constitutions and Digestive Therapeutics, where she took some of her work that she was doing in the early 1900s on Terrawina, which was this product that was created, to kind of soothe settler indigestion using the products from Native Hawaiians. And I fast forwarded 100 years to look at the way that ancestral microbiome research was positioning the gut microbes of Indigenous people as a potential therapeutic to soothe the indigestions of living in a modern world and having quote unquote missing microbes. And we kind of were able to theorize across this time and space about the way that Indigenous people and places have and continue to be sites of extraction for colonial technoscience. And that's, something that I'm continuing to explore and think with in the work that we continue to do around microbiology or contemporary microbiology and its role in gut health. Another fun project that I was able to start, actually I invited Sean to come to Davis in 2018 and we developed this workshop together, but I've been leading it independently with other friends, with my kids. Oftentimes they have to help. Is a fermentation workshop, a community fermentation workshop that's co-hosted by my public library branch here in Davis, California. And the intention of this workshop was to be, I call it non-dogmatic pedagogy. And what that looks like in practice is, how can I give people the most, the barest amount of information, not to frustrate them, but to provide space for people to be creative and explore and ask questions and try new things in the context of making fermented foods together. And you can see the photo there with the pink tablecloth. We set it up in these long shared tables where all the materials are, you collectively decide what goes into it, you mix it together, you get to know your neighbors and other people through this practice of fermentation, and then everyone gets to take a jar home for themselves and watch that transformation take place over the next few days or weeks. It's had to move online, unfortunately, because of COVID. So I've been leading the workshop now out of my home, but then I provide kits to everybody in the community afterwards and I deliver them. So there's a box of kits ready to go. Or sometimes I leave them at the public library. So for me, this was a way to bring some of my ideas about the potential of fermentation as a community practice, to bring those into practice somehow. And it was important that it was free, that it was accessible, and that people could be invited to participate in it with a very low barrier to entry. And that's what's actually so great about doing it at the library, is you get a lot of folks just walking in, or whenever story time ends, children just come running into the room and we get started all over again. And it's been a really fun pedagogical experience as well. My last example of, collective experiments using fermentation is a ongoing, work that I've been doing with friends. We call ourselves the HYPHA Collective. And it's composed of Anush Vaidya and Mercedes Vijalba, and an honorary member, Joe Dumit, who does co-teaching experiments with us. And here's a photo of us here. We use fermentation certainly in the work that we do. We have done several experiments with fermentation, and we've also, for the most part, though, HYPHA comes from taking mycelium and mushrooms and fungi as an inspiration for how we might make new things in the world, how we might work together, and how we might be inspired to take on new projects that are at our fancy, really at our whim. And some of the things we've done is we've used, kombucha scobies as art making material. And so there's a photo there of an art piece that we created in response to a community call for healing arts. We also have made jewelry out of kombucha leather, quote unquote, kombucha fabrics. we created a storytelling game using cards and inspirations from mushrooms and fungi to kind of tell the story of a future human myco world. And we've played that game in classes that we've taught here at UC Davis with UC Davis undergrads. And we've been inspired by the science fiction of Octavia Butler as a kind of speculative project for telling stories about the future that it like reflects the problems of the present. And so we try to use her methodology in the Myco Worlds game that we created, as well as books by folks like Anna Singh, The Mushroom at the End of the World, and The Undercommons, which is a kind of way of thinking about fugitive work within the university itself, informed by Black Studies scholarship. So this is just another example, I think, of the way that I've tried to incorporate mycelium or fermentation as a methodology for doing things in the world, for doing things with others, and paying attention to processes, to relationships, and ultimately allow that to help me make a life rather than to make a kind of concrete outcome or research project. Which leads me to this group. So the Radical and Relational Fermentation Cluster, I was so excited to hear about the work that Jessica and Maria were doing together and the courses they were proposing, and just thrilled to get the chance to work more closely with Aviaya. And I think that for me, I'm not a microbiologist, I'm not an Indigenous studies, expert scholar, but I think that my my intersection at the space of fermentation as method, as practice, as theory, as well as my interest in feminist science and technology studies, and the work that I do with many others in community engaged research practice is my contribution, to this group. So in terms of community engaged research, I am really interested in research that is with, by, and for, which Jessica explained a lot or very well in the context of Indigenous studies in her presentation 2 weeks ago. I am for research that is about expanding what counts as knowledge and who are knowledge makers, which Jessica also talked about as densifying, the way we think about knowledge. I'm particularly interested because UC Davis is a public research institution of the role of the public institution in higher learning and its commitments and its responsibilities to its neighbors and to the people that it is meant to serve. And I find that community engaged research is a really important way for us to think about those relationships seriously, and to take the knowledge that is produced within the university and think of that not as just a one-way, output, but as a much more fluid sharing of resources and of expertise. And again, attention to process rather than product is kind of fundamental in the way that I think about this work. In terms of, science, this comes from STS training. Science for me is about thinking of knowledge-making practices. So many things can be science. There's a way that we talk about capital S science, which is the kind of formalization of science, scientific fields of study. But if science, I think of it more expansively as any kind of set of knowledge-making practices. And that means that those knowledges are situated. They come from somewhere. Feminist scholars have told us that these knowledges come from a standpoint, and they are not neutral. They're not, objective, as in divorced from human experience or human reality. Sciences have contexts, they have politics, they have histories, and that shapes what is even asked in the first place. What is a research question? It shapes what can be known, and it shapes the how that can be known. And it's about paying attention to that and being honest about those processes, which I think actually will lead to a better science. And feminist in all the things that I do, I mean feminist as being justice-based, being transformative, about making change, and being intersectional, right? That again, feminism is not just about quote unquote women or sexism, but about the kind of interlocking systems of oppression that depend upon one another for their meaning and power in the world. So for feminist means to me to seek knowledges and experiences from the margins. And ultimately, the project is to identify and undo cis heteropatriarchal white supremacist values, norms, ideologies, as well as those interlocking systems of power. And not only to identify and undo them, but fundamentally to offer something in its place. And that has been, honestly, one of the challenges of being in the university, being an academic, is that I've become trained to be very good at identifying those things and calling them out. And I've been trained to be less good at offering something in its place. And I hope that, since finishing my degree, I am trying to cultivate new ways of knowing and being in the world that make it easier for me to offer something else. Not only to call out, the interlocking systems of oppression, but like abolitionists, to be able to offer a vision of the future that is one that we want, that is inviting and that is liberating for all of us. So that's it for my presentation. I really welcome questions from folks. I saw some activity in the chat, and but first I think Maria will respond a little bit, and I'm going to stop sharing my presentation.
Thanks, Stephanie. That was wonderful. I sat spellbound. Can you hear me? As I went through my through your talks, and I was thinking about really how heartfelt you were, and sort of breaking down those artificial barriers we set up when we give talks, at least I do, and giving the personal perspective of who you are and how you reached the variety of works that you're involved with. So one question that I kind of sat with while you were talking was how you reached this topic of food fermentation, microbiome science. Little perspective myself, I'm Slovakian Italian, and I grew up watching my grandma making fermented cucumbers or pickles, and I didn't think much of it at the time, but now as I think back, I think that gave me some motivation to the work that I'm doing now. So I wonder if you could share that perspective with us.
That's great. It's a great question. Yeah, I came to this research topic because my master's work I was studying material culture. I was in an English program, and I was fascinated in material cultural studies, the way that the things that are a part of our life have histories and shape our lives and play an important role. So not just, the texts or the politics or the people, but the actual material objects themselves are imbued with value. And I started to research in that area, and I came upon food. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting ephemeral thing that we could consider material culture. And so I started to learn more about food studies. And at the time, I was also really interested and had some great mentorship at Arizona State University to think more about the British colonial context. And I was kind of starting to read some early things around, what processes of colonization and how the psychological impacts of that and what that looks like. And I was kind of reading theories of what we would call now like decolonial theory. At the time, I didn't know that's what it was. And I was trying to educate myself about those practices. And that all kind of cohered in my master's thesis, which tracked through recipes and material cultural objects like spice inventories and spice boxes and catalogs, the way that the British took the diverse, dense foodstuffs of India and condensed them down into something they called curry, that they then made recipes about and wrote letters to each other, and was some of the first commercially available spice mixtures. So it was a part of capitalism and extraction. And so I was fascinated at how food could be a part of these stories that we tell. And I proposed to do a similar project here at UC Davis. And they accepted my proposal after a second time. They didn't accept it the first time, they accepted it the second time for a different program. And I thought for sure that's what I was going to continue to do my work in that area. But like many grad students, I had to take multiple jobs to pay my bills. And one of those jobs was with the food science department, where I was working with a group of researchers, and I was just helping them make their website and, maybe do some interviews. And, but I started to really pay attention to the work that they were doing. And they were talking about this American Gut Project, which was a crowdsourced citizen science project where they were asking people to provide fecal samples that they would then run through their machines in order to figure out what microbes were, kind of were in the gut or survived the process. And the more I learned about that, and the more I started to learn about the way that science and technology were tied into these colonial processes of extraction and knowledge making, that eventually cohered in this project where I was looking closely at human microbiome science and the way that it was producing ideas about eating and bodies and relations to the microbial world. So it was definitely through people, it was through following something that I thought was interesting, but not without a lot of, frustration. Because I really thought I was going to do something else in grad school, and then I didn't.
I think we all think that too. But kind of building on this idea, it seemed like a really transformative moment for you is when you visited Tennessee and spent the summer with Sandra Katz and the collective there. And so I wonder, in this relationship to fermented foods, is there something special or specific about fermented foods that, really lends itself to this concept and not other foods, other practices of food making?
Yeah, that's a great, that's a really good question. And I guess, I have friends who study plants and agriculture, and they are just as moved by how plants communicate with each other and how they, transform their environments. And certainly I'm fascinated with the way fungus does this too. So I don't think that it's only fermentation. But that being said, as someone who also practices food fermentation, I continue to be as surprised and amazed and in wonder of how things literally transform in front of your eyes. There's something about the time scale that is so real and visceral with fermented foods that makes those kinds of observations just much more easier to see and acknowledge, which is interesting because it's all about the invisible work of microbes, but there's something about watching fermentation happen that actually makes that work or that those lives real and visible to us. But I'll say though that I talk about fermentation as a process, and I'm attuning myself to the transformative aspects of it. But that certainly doesn't mean that anything that is a fermented food or any practice that involves fermentation is about, social justice and transforming the world, at all. And so I have to, remind myself as well that the way I imagine the kind of potential of or the potential of fermentation is because it's where I'm coming from and the values that I'm bringing to those kinds of theorizations, and that it is not in fact inherent in the thing itself at all. Like all things, it exists, my ideas about fermentation exist from my own standpoint and my own worldview.
Yeah. Well, you brought up microbes. So I teach food microbiology. I've taught microbiology for many years, and it's always like the hard subject. It's always people either love it or hate it. Most often it's just considered a hard course or a hard discipline. And so I wonder, you were talking about filling a void or filling space, like how this work, thinking about feminist practices, do you think this work and what you've described with the community ferment can help reduce barriers in STEM education, or kind of is there a window being somebody from outside the discipline of microbiology to see value in how this could relate in education?
Yeah, I think that, that's a really good question. And I like that it's kind of rooted in things you've seen and witnessed as an educator in microbiology. I am very inspired by the work here at UC Davis by the Feminist Research Institute that we have on campus. And they have a project right now called Asking Different Questions. And I love that project, and I'm very much on board with what they're doing, because I think a lot of the times the questions around barriers to STEM fields, or why certain people or certain communities don't feel that they belong or feel that they're excluded from certain scientific disciplines, and others as well, like philosophy, it's like notorious for having a white man problem. So it's not that it's exclusive to science, but what I like about what Feminist Research Institute is doing is that they're saying, what is it about the fact that microbiology, it has a history in the way that it developed as a field, and decisions were made by people to formalize knowledge on certain topics using certain methods, and through the accumulation of that body of knowledge, which that's how science happens, as people do peer-reviewed work, you're able to replicate it, and you actually build on one another's knowledges. But what can happen over time is that certain kinds of questions become the question of the field, and certain kinds of methods and certain kinds of things that look like research or look like good knowledge, according to the journal or according to whatever, the professional society. Those things become norms and they become codified in the field. And so it's not so much how do we make other people find that exciting, but how do we transform the way we do knowledge, the kinds of questions we ask, so that they see themselves in that kind of practice. And so, yeah, I think that, for example, there was some cool work I saw with like in kind of environmental sciences, where there was a group that was helping folks make homemade air quality monitors that then they could put in their community and see real-time data about air pollution. And that might be way more important to somebody, and along the way they need to learn about microbes, and they need to learn about air and weather patterns and very delicate sensing equipment. But it's answering different kinds of questions and using different kinds of methods to do that. And I think that's what is exciting for me, thinking about what are the possibilities for microbiology there.
Yeah, that's definitely, as you described it, I see as a really positive way forward to include others in the topic of microbiology and reframe the question. So actually, kind of a good segue to my next question to you, which is more going to your writings. But just to start, microbiology as a discipline really took off in the mid-late 1800s with the work of Pasteur, Robert Koch, and the crisis of the time was reducing rates of infectious disease, which, for every time up to that in human history has been the main cause of mortality in people. And, through the evolution, the development of microbiology of a field, it's really about microbes as germs. Microbes are entities that are bad and need to be eliminated. And in your writing, you point out and kind of highlight the idea of nutrition and probiotics, and microbes could be good for us. And this is absolutely the shift in the kind of new microbiology revolution we're having right now, to think that they, are good. We want to encourage microbes as we would in fermented foods. And this, I think, relates to your critique of microbiome science work performed with and on HASDA peoples, specifically pointing to the writings of Jeff Leach, where, we kind of enter possibly other danger zone. Is our interest now to extract the good microbes from Indigenous peoples and replace harmful microbes present in industrial bodies, people who are in the US or with increased concern or awareness of allergy, atopic dermatitis, and ways to treat that. So, in some perspective, we're moving away from industrial, military complex type language, maybe to other type languages in science. So yeah, I'm wondering, can you think of any frameworks, questions, queries that are missing or needed in microbiome and fermented food research that are currently not there? And what are the risks if we don't include them?
Yeah, that's great. Oh yeah, one of the things I tracked in my dissertation was a shift within microbiology and the biological sciences, actually more broadly, from thinking of germs as warfare, as the enemy. So kind of using a militaristic approach to, and the body as well. There's this, there's a feminist anthropologist, Emily Martin, who writes about the immunological body that was often portrayed as one that had to defend against, right? That the skin was actually like a shield, and we had to defend against the outside world. And that's kind of how we understood immunology for a long time. But of course, this human science, the science of the human microbiome, and well before that too, helps us to understand that the body is porous, it's open to the environment. And maybe the warfare metaphors really get in the way of actually understanding what is happening to the human body and its relationships to its environment. And I've noticed replacing these warfare metaphors with ecological ones. So a lot of the language now is about the human body as an ecosystem, or maybe our gut is an ecosystem, or it's its own little world. And it's about, we are kind of incorporating the language from, broad scale ecology or animal ecology, right? That there are niches, there are specialized places on the body where we can think about microbes as living in more of an ecological relationship with each other, with our bodies, and then of course human beings as a part of our own ecologies with folks who are doing research on the microbiology of the built environment. So we are affected by the microbes that are always around us. So I think that there's a lot of potential in thinking about an ecological framework or metaphor for thinking of the body. It certainly helps us stop such kind of either or thinking, right? It's either inside the body or outside the body, like the way that the warfare metaphors did. There's either enemies or foes, and so the ecological metaphor provides for a more expansive approach to talking about different actors and interactions. But, of course, it's not like conservation ecology is a perfect way to think about these things, or that it doesn't have its own problems, and that we end up with charismatic microbes, the good ones that we want to cultivate in our gut. Or we start to think about our bodies not as open relationships with the world, but as parks that we need to manage and landscape and control what comes in and out. And that, I think, is, to get onto what you said about Jeff Leach and like my critique of ancestral microbiome research, is that it's a similar problematic there, where it's not that I don't think there should be research on the microbial populations of the guts of Hadza people or landscapes. It's just to what end? And the way that a lot of that research is framed is about dealing with the kinds of autoimmune disorders and problems that are arising from within Western bodies, and thinking again about the global South as a place of extraction, as a therapeutic space, rather than, you know, I guess a science that practice of that would, you know, ultimately be about answering questions that those folks had about their own bodies and their own microbes. And, you know, I'm curious to see the way that especially citizen science or participatory science projects can do that more fully in a more kind of reciprocal way in the work they do. And yeah, I don't have a ton of examples of those yet, but I think that it's something that folks are aware of for sure. And I think there's probably a lot of good projects out there where people are taking that seriously.
So I want to acknowledge and thank those who provided questions in the Q&A. I'd like to ask at least one question. I have many, obviously, but from that list, but you mentioned community science, and I don't want to change a train of thought exactly yet. So you mentioned citizen science or community science could be a way forward. Are there risks with community science projects in terms of
yeah, I mean, I'll say, yeah, absolutely. I think it's I only mean to say that that there's potential and there's interest there, but not that it's like it will cure problems with the way we do it. Because honestly, a lot of citizen science projects are just about having people do your data collection for you, you know, and submit that on your behalf. And that's not participatory, that's just outsourcing, you know. And similarly, like the way, especially, you know, going back to the way that somebody like the story of Henrietta Lacks, who gave, you know, or was not told that her materials were going to be taken from her body and now form the baseline for all of the kind of cellular research we do on cancer in the United States and beyond, and well beyond. The HeLa cell line, of course, is used in all kinds of labs all over the world. And so I think there's tons of ethical questions about what it means to give one's data, one's body materials over to a project where you don't have control over what happens, what is made from that data, and the kind of afterlife of your bodily products. And I think until those questions get sorted out and or are a part of the way that these citizen science projects proceed in the first place, yeah, there will be endless risks and issues and those kinds of problems. Like, what is consent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So I guess one last question. From your dissertation, you used the term probiotic present. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Yeah, that was my catchy theoretical intervention. I used it to name both a time and I guess a space. So I call this, you know, moment the probiotic present because I think it's signaling, like our first discussion question here, a shift from an antibiotic you know, way that an antibiotic relationship to the microbial world to a probiotic relationship with the microbial world that is becoming more commonplace in scientific fields like microbiology, but also anybody who walks down a grocery aisle now, you know, and you can see that literal word is something that we know about. It's increasingly a part of our medicalization practices. So it's about both naming and orientation to microbes in our society, but then also kind of acknowledging the way that word itself has seeped into our common knowledge. And it's something, especially if you're anybody who pays attention to health and lifestyle blogs, or you are concerned about diet and exercise, you know, that's a word you know now, and it has meaning, and it's in many ways become a kind of framing word for us to understand what the relationship is between humans and microorganisms. And so I use it just to kind of call it out as something that is worth exploring and not worth kind of naturalizing.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephanie. Wonderful to talk with you. Wonderful presentation, and just so glad to be working with you on this project. So with that, I want to thank everyone for, thank everybody for joining, everyone here for joining and participating in our seminar series. We have one more coming up on March 11th and at 11 a.m. Pacific Coast time. So be sure to register if you haven't already and join us as we go into our last of our conversations here, again on March 11th. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Aviaya and Jessica. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone who participated.